Hope Not Hate's latest report, titled The State of Hate 2025, paints a concerning picture. It reads, the far right poses its biggest political threat in Britain since World War II. At the ballot box, on the streets and online, the far right in all its guises is increasingly confident, assertive and growing. Reform UK, of course, won 14.3% of the vote at the last election. And last summer, Stephen Yaxley-Lennon, a.k.a. Tommy Robinson, held the largest far-right rally in British history. Hope Not Hate's Joe Mulhall, the report's deputy editor, is the man to ask about all this. Joe, you've compiled the who's who of rotters. People I didn't know about, people I'd forgotten about. They all suck. Can you just briefly explain the purpose and methodology here?
Yeah, so the State of Hate is a report we produce every year and have done for about a decade or so. And the front half of it is essentially a series of analysis. So what's the far right up to? Where are the threats coming from? What's that form of politics looking like in British society, including a huge amount of polling data? And then the back end is we profile all of the main organisations and individuals across a whole range, ranging from the most extreme kind of neo-Nazi terrorist networks through to the populist radical right. And the idea is that it's a resource which allows people to find out who are the most important figures spreading xenophobic and pernicious politics in Britain now.
So why do you think the far right is more successful now than in the 70s with the National Front, probably in the 30s with Oswald Mosley, where the numbers would actually of the British Union fascists were not that great? Why now?
So, of course, this all depends on how one defines the far right.
Of course, and I'm going to get on to reform because if they're listening, I don't think that everyone in reform is far right.
No, and we make a really clear distinction about reform. Reform as a party sits very comfortably in any definition of far right. It sits within the populist radical right side of it. Any academic definitions they would fit very comfortably in. But 4.1 million people voted for them in the last election. It's not to say that we have 4.1 million far-right people. In a very similar way, at the height of the British National Party, 1 million people voted for the BNP. That was an explicitly fascist party. We didn't have 1 million fascists. I think it's possible to separate them out. But if you look at last year, you mentioned the election, which is, say 14.3% of the vote, which is the largest vote share for a populist radical right or far right party ever in Britain by some margin. You mentioned the Tommy Robinson demonstration in July, 40,000 people on the streets to stand in front and listen to a whole wide range of very, very far right figures. And then, of course, we have the riots, where over 7 days we saw the most widespread period of far right violence of the entire post-war period. And within that, you've got the various manifestations of far-right politics, electoral politics, protest politics, and of course violent politics. And so together it creates a scene where, ranging from all elements of the far right on that broad definition of the far right, they're on the rise and the biggest they've been in some time.
And it's part of that there's this international network. I mean, again, I think the theme of this episode is to blame the internet. With people like Elon Musk and Steve Bannon constantly trying to unite all these different groups. Are there more? Because in the 30s, international connections were a little bit more problematic. So it's just part of it, that the back and forth between them all.
There's a common, and it depends which bit of the far right you're looking at. I mean, there's no doubt that there is a sense amongst the far right, not just in the UK, but around all over the world, that there is a sense of kind of epochal change, that they are rising. I remember my job at Hope Not Hate for many years was going to far right events for Hope Not Hate. And they used to talk about rising from the ruins, because they felt that they were, just 10 years ago, that there was just no chance. And then they started talking about after the fall of liberal democracy. And now they're saying we're changing the world. And when we talk about this thing that says they are offering this vision of change, as much as we disagree with what that would look like and the likelihood of it, they point to somewhere else and say, look, they've won there, look what they're doing. So it becomes a more realistic vision of change. And then, really importantly, beyond the traditional parties that we have in each country, there's now these vast decentralised networks of far-right activists that operate ostensibly like a school of fish around the internet, that may coagulate around a particular country or a particular election, get involved and then dissipate and move off again. And they're like synapses which allow tactics, finances, ideas and ideology to move around the globe in real time, which means that each time there's a new election or a new protest, they can draw like a hive mind of the global far right, which makes them more effective and unfortunately better funded.
We keep hearing that there's growing support for reform among young people, or at least young men. Is that Is that true? Is that real?
Well, yes, to a certain extent, yes. We are seeing higher numbers of we're seeing higher numbers of young men getting involved in far-right politics across the board, and we are seeing a higher number of young men getting involved in reform. I think it's worth putting it in context. There's clearly a increasing divide amongst young people between women engaging in more progressive politics and men getting drawn into more reactionary politics. It's still overwhelmingly, most young people are still more likely to be progressive, but that number of people, especially amongst young men that are getting involved in far-right politics, is growing. And not just here, we saw it similar with support, for example, amongst young men in Argentina with Milei, AfD vote in Germany as well. It's not about saying that all young men have become reactionary. It's about saying that an increasing number of young people are starting to engage in far-right politics in a way that just wasn't the case 10 years ago.
Last summer's riots are at the heart of the report, obviously. What do you think has been their legacy?
What I think is remarkable is how little we talk about them now. How quickly they just disappeared off the agenda. This was, as I say, the most widespread period of far-right violence of the whole post-war period in Britain. People getting dragged out of people stopping cars, checking the colour of the driver and pulling the people of colour out of the car. People burning down or attempting to burn down a hotel.
Well, I'm starting to think of pre-war examples.
Well, yeah, no, I would say probably in the whole of the 20th century, possibly, right? And yet, it's never mentioned anymore. And part of it was, it was shut down very quickly. But I think it unleashed a lot of uncomfortable truths, which was, yes, I would argue, for example, that the moment you pick up a brick and throw it at a mosque, whether or not you are a member of a party or an organisation, you are engaging in far-right activism, right? Very, very quickly we saw that a lot of the media start to shift towards saying this is unfair to call these people far-right. They're just disgruntled. They're just angry. There is a lot of disgruntled and angry people out there that are right to be angry about their situation and the state of their communities and country, right? But the moment that you turn up and start screaming racist slurs at a mosque, you're engaging in far-right activism, even if you're not a member of the British National Party. And so I wonder if people became increasingly uncomfortable that what it actually said about Britain, which was that very, very quickly, after a horrifying attack, right, and let's not forget that, a horrifying attack against these young girls, how quickly that metastasized from that particular issue into a wider set of grievances about the failure of multiculturalism, about immigration, about Islam and Muslims, and how quickly that debate turned to violence. And I think people find that really, really scary, and some people are just not wanting to look at it.
Well, you use the Southport killer as an example of these, the terrorist threat from ideologically fluid young men, who aren't clear-cut neo-Nazis, but they take inspiration from all over. I think the former head of the FBI called this salad bar ideology. And it's really very confusing if you've got in your head, left and right, and where are you on the spectrum? Do you think the police and the government's Prevent programme have sufficiently caught up with this weird muddling of political positions?
No, not yet. I mean, there is at least some discussion of it. We still have your very traditional ideological terrorists, right, who are either neo-Nazi or Islamist or that come. The difference in the digital age is, traditionally, if you wanted to get hold of the most extreme material from any of these movements, Islamists, Nazi, whatever it was, you had to be within that scene before you could get access to it. You might have to know the person to get the books from, or write a letter to America and get a book list, etc. Now this is all so freely available on the internet that you can sit at home, and as long as you have a Telegram account, you can get hold of IRA bomb-making manuals from the 70s, ISIS content, neo-Nazi content from ETA. And so it's allowed people to pick and choose. And so people who are just, their primary motivation is like a fetishization of violence and death and murder, don't necessarily have to cross an ideological threshold into a particular movement. They can crowdsource all of these things, anyone that is engaged in this sort of stuff, which was just impossible before the internet.
Right. Well, if you're sort of talking after 9/11, if you found someone with an Al-Qaeda manual, which the Southport killer had, you could probably safely conclude that they were an Islamist terrorist. Whereas in his case, it was just another thing.
Yeah, he also had IRA content.
Yeah.
Because he got some of that as well. He was interested in the means by which they were creating change as much as the ideas that drove it.
So you identify a huge network of far-right groups and influences, and they really do range, like you said, to the mainstream party, like Reform, to just people called, Valkyrie, Hellwind, or whatever. Let's talk about some of the key agents of radicalisation that people will be more aware of. you've got these figures that you mentioned, like Dan Wootton, Lawrence Fox, Calvin Robinson, and more, all coming through GB News. Obviously, Farage has a show. How influential is GB News? Which, of course, we would not want to call a far right station. It's just that it keeps tripping over far right figures in the studio.
So it's been hugely influential, right, in a number of different ways. Firstly, a huge amount of people who are central to reform have worked for the platform, right? And I mean, there's a whole set of questions here for Ofcom, obviously, in terms of why they've allowed this to happen. But it's been a real engine room of radical right politics. And the big effect it's had, it has normalised and mainstreamed it, because people can flick on their Skybox, past Sky News, past the BBC, then you get to GB News, and it looks like a news channel. And yet the reality of it is that it's got individuals on there over the last two or so years, some of which have pumped out really extreme conspiratorial content, some of which have gone through it and end up in further right spaces. But because it's presented as a normal news channel, for many people it's normalised and mainstreamed this form of politics. It's just essentially taken what was traditionally relatively niche radical right talking points and broadcast it on a national scale and engaged with elements of the right wing of the Conservative Party. I think this is kind of symbiotic thing whereby it's radicalising elements of the British right, and the British right is then also being elevated through GB News.
Well, what's happening with the Tories? Because Robert Jenrick, not so long ago, was saying exactly the kind of things that led Ted Heath to sack Enoch Powell from the front bench in 1968. Kemi Badenoch did nothing. Suella Braverman, obviously not on the front bench, was endorsing the extremely fringe ethno-nationalist view that children of immigrants like herself can't really be English. Some pretty far out stuff where you're actually like, are they any better at drawing lines here than Reform are? Like, how does that change things? Because that's not something you would have said about the Tory party a few years ago.
So this was a really difficult issue for Hope Not Hate. As an anti-fascist organisation, obviously these people aren't fascists, but we've expanded out over the years to UKIP and Reform, etc. A few years ago, me and a colleague, or me and our CEO, Nick Lowles, wrote a report called Turning Right about the Conservative Party. And the big issue there is you could still find articles in British newspapers saying that Britain is the exception. We've got the rising radical right all over Europe. We're the exception because this was not long ago that Reform barely existed here. And yet we were arguing that you were seeing the same radicalisation, but it was on the right of the Conservative Party, where an element on the right of the Conservative Party were engaging in politics which was indistinguishable from European radical right-wing parties. But it was confined because of our electoral system within a broad coalition party. And then, of course, a lot of that has spilled out in the last election where Reform rose very quickly, and we can see now a specifically radical right party. But within that, there is a huge normalisation of politics that previously would have been confined to the margins of our politics. I think one of the big breakthrough moments, for example, was when talk of invasion was happening from within the Conservative government. Again, this was a narrative that we'd been tracking from really small marginal groups in 2016, 17, 18, to it being said at the dispatch box by a Home Secretary. They normalised a form of radical right politics, which ironically they then got eaten by, or are increasingly being eaten by, in the form of Reform.
Wasn't this when Braverman was Home Secretary?
I mean, talking of the radicalisation of formerly respected institutions, you zoom in on the career of Matthew Goodwin, who's gone from this sort of politics professor chronicling the far right to a sort of full-throated cheerleader for it, and also just all-round bad person. What happened to him?
He's a fascinating case study because right now I think he's a genuinely influential figure. Not least he has a show on GB News. His Substack is enormous. It reaches huge amounts of people. And he creates a veneer of respectability, once again, to quite extreme forms of politics. When he talks about incompatibility with Islam, when he talks about immigration, when he talks about the grooming gangs, etc. Much of his politics is indistinguishable from what you would have traditionally called overtly far-right politics. But the reason he's so dangerous is, having spent many years as a researcher of the far right, an academic that looked at the far right, traditionally he always had a sympathy for people that voted for far right parties, which I understood, which was these people are angry and upset. The difference now is that he has a sympathy for the parties that are preying on those vulnerable communities. And he knows the buttons to push. He's spent years working out, through polling, for example, what it is that makes people vote for radical right parties. And he is now using that information to hit those talking points. Firstly, I think in his own interest. There's a huge amount of self-interest in what he's doing, but also using it to bolster and to help reform.
it is a really fascinating little sort of personality profile. I'd recommend listeners download the report. But that bit, there's a lot going on in his head, I would say.
Where's the general public on this? Because it's interesting that even though support for multiculturalism and inclusive kind of Britishness has fallen since the riots, it's still higher than it was in 2011. Have we really seen a shift since last July at all?
I mean, things have obviously been bad since the riots. I think what we're seeing, which is perhaps most concerning around this, is attitudes around things like racism, etc., have got increasingly good, and attitudes broadly across about modern Britain immigration have got better over the last decade or so. There is a growing number of people that think multiculturalism has failed or is in some form of crisis, depending on how their definitions of multiculturalism. And that's certainly being reflected more in mainstream discussion. I mean, not that new in some ways. David Cameron said it, I think, back in 2011. But that's increasingly more of a discussion, which is maybe multiculturalism has just failed. The big worrying number when you look at the polling in the report, though, is about the massive growth in people that are angry and disenfranchised with politics more broadly, that want an alternative. So many people, and the reason that so many people are angry at politics and feel that it's not meeting their needs is because it's not. There is a huge amount of places in the country that you go to. I was, as I say, up in the northeast last week. It's no surprise that people in those communities are angry at both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, because after decades of those two being in power, they don't feel like their lives have got better. In fact, they can say they've materially got worse. And so people don't feel politics is working for them, and that's why they're looking for alternatives.
So as you say, people are pessimistic about Britain. It's the main factor in voting for reform. What can the government realistically do to make people feel that democracy is working for them? Because they're clearly not feeling it at the moment, given the latest polls, which put Labour in third place.
I think there's a couple of things that need to happen as a matter of urgency. One is they need to work on a hyper-local level. What is it that the local community actually cares about? Yes, national politics is important, international politics is important. But, in certain areas it's about flood defences, or it's about the local leisure centre, or it's about their local A&E being shut down or not being up to standard. People have to be reminded that local politics works for them and makes their lives better, and that they'll only be reminded of that if the Labour Party do that. The danger is, I fear, is that the Labour Party are going to run right on things like immigration to try and deal with the threat from reform. But that's not actually going to work. The polling's so clear that reformist support is not a homogenous bloc. It's so varied and often driven by other issues. If the Labour Party want to win it back, they need to go into the communities they're losing. They need to listen. They need to engage, and they need to make those people's lives better, whether or not that's jobs, houses, schools, hospitals, flood defences, potholes, dog poo on the street. They need to show that they actually are making people's lives better. Otherwise, they're going to get wiped out.
I think, as I've said before, that if you look at a lot of polling of reform voters, half of them are exactly what you would fear, and the other half are kind of all over the shop, and they've got really very diverse views. You break them down in the report, but it's really interesting that it is not just this big immovable block at all.
It's absolutely not. We break it down throughout. We did a mega poll of 22,000 people around the country and had a big chunk of reform voters in there, and we break it down into 5 groups. Some of them, as you say, exactly as the number one issue for them is immigration and those sorts of issues. Other groups that are in there that are voting them care about workers' rights. They're concerned about the climate. They're less, I would say, less Greenpeace and more National Trust, but they're worried about the state of the planet and their communities in that sense. They want better workers' rights. These are all wedge issues, actually, that I think means that we can separate big chunks of the support away from Farage. They want nationalisation of industries in certain communities, etc. The issue is if you see Reform's bloc as a single homogenous bloc that only cares about immigration, then the answer that people come up with is to shift right on immigration, which won't work anyway.
And where can people get your report?
On our website, hopenothate.org.uk, and we've also got hard copies for people that still read hard copies.
It's like a sort of certain parts of it when you're profiling them, like a Panini sticker album of racists.
That's a good idea for next year, actually. We could raise some funds. We could sell the stickers.
Exactly. You've got, I've got Calvin Robinson.
Yeah. I've got a swap of Tommy Robinson. I've got loads of Tommy.